The silence in the Riverside Public Library's third-floor study section was supposed to be sacred, but to Emma Chun, it felt more like a fragile shield that could shatter at any moment. She had claimed the corner table near the philosophy section, not because she loved ancient wisdom, but because it offered the best view of approaching footsteps and two possible escape routes. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up as the daughter of immigrant parents who worked 18-hour days at their small electronics repair shop, Emma had learned that survival often meant being invisible, and libraries were the perfect camouflage for someone who preferred shadows to spotlights. Emma's calculus textbook lay open to Chapter 12, Derivatives and Integral Swimming, before her tired eyes as she tried to focus on anything other than the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach. At 17, she carried herself with the careful posture of someone who had learned that making herself smaller meant drawing less attention. And in a town like Riverside, where being different often meant being a target, attention was the last thing she wanted. Her black hair fell like a curtain around her face, a deliberate barrier between herself and a world that had never quite made space for quiet girls who spoke with slight accents and wore secondhand clothes that never quite fit the way designer labels did on her classmates. The third floor of the library had become her sanctuary over the past 6 months, ever since her mother had finally saved enough money to buy Emma a used laptop for her senior year at Riverside High. The computer was ancient by teenage standards. A thick Dell that wheezed when it booted up and took forever to load even basic websites. But it was hers, and more importantly, it meant she could study somewhere other than the cramped apartment above her parents' shop where the smell of solder and the sound of Spanish soap operas made concentration impossible. Her parents, Rosa and Miguel Chen, had immigrated from the Philippines when Emma was 3, carrying nothing but determination and a shared dream that their daughter would have opportunities they never did. They spoke to her in a mixture of Tagalog and broken English, their voices filled with pride whenever she brought home report cards covered in A's, but also with worry whenever she came home with bruises she claimed were from gym class accidents. Emma had discovered early that being academically gifted was both a blessing and a curse in a school where intellectual achievement often painted targets on the backs of students who didn't fit the accepted social hierarchy. She had skipped 2 grades, which meant she was 15 when she started high school and 17 now as a senior, younger than most of her classmates and infinitely more isolated. Her teachers praised her mathematical mind and her ability to grasp complex concepts with an ease that made advanced placement courses feel like elementary puzzles. But her peers saw her academic success as a threat to the carefully maintained social order where popularity mattered more than problem solving and conformity trumped creativity every time. The bullying had started small, as these things always do, with whispered comments about her clothes and Snickers when she raised her hand in class. Emma had learned to shrink into herself during those moments, to make her voice smaller when she answered questions correctly while star athletes struggled with basic algebra. She ate lunch alone in empty classrooms, completed group projects by herself when partners mysteriously found excuses to work with someone else, and perfected the art of walking through hallways like a ghost, present but somehow invisible to the casual cruelty that seemed to follow her wherever she went. But the library was different. Here, among the musty smell of old books and the gentle hum of fluorescent lights, Emma could spread her materials across an entire table without apologizing for taking up space. She could think without constantly looking over her shoulder, could lose herself in the beautiful logic of mathematical equations, where every problem had a solution and every question had a definitive answer. The librarians, Mrs. Rodriguez and Mr. Kim, treated her with the kind of respectful kindness that teachers reserve for their most dedicated students, and the few other regular patrons were serious students or elderly researchers who appreciated the sanctity of silence. Emma's daily routine had become as predictable as clockwork. School ended at 3:15, and by 3:30 she was climbing the stairs to the third floor, her backpack heavy with textbooks and the laptop that represented her family's sacrifice. She would claim her corner table, spread her materials with methodical precision, and work until the library closed at 9, breaking only for a quick dinner of whatever snack she had packed from home. Her parents never questioned these long absences, understanding instinctively that their daughter had found a safe harbor in a world that often felt hostile to young women who dared to be different. The calculus homework that spread before her now represented more than just academic achievement. It was her ticket to a full scholarship at the state university, her pathway out of Riverside and into a future where her intelligence would be celebrated rather than resented. Her guidance counselor, Ms. Patterson, had been cautiously optimistic about Emma's chances at several prestigious programs, but only if she maintained her perfect grade point average through graduation. Every assignment mattered, every test score could be the difference between a full ride and a crushing burden of student debt that would trap her family in the cycle of financial struggle they had fought so hard to escape. Emma had been working for nearly 2 hours when she first heard the voices echoing up from the second floor, loud enough to violate the library's sacred quiet, but not quite loud enough to trigger intervention from the staff downstairs. She recognized the laughter immediately, the particular brand of cruel amusement that had followed her through 4 years of high school hallways. Her stomach clenched as she realized that her sanctuary was about to be invaded by the very people she came here to escape. The voices belonged to Brandon Mitchell and his 2 closest friends, Kyle Rodriguez and Danny Park, 3 seniors who had elevated casual cruelty into an art form and seemed to view Emma's academic success as a personal insult to their own mediocrity. Brandon was the unofficial leader, a 6-foot-tall football player whose broad shoulders and easy smile had carried him through high school on a wave of athletic scholarships and social privileges that he wielded like weapons against anyone who threatened his carefully constructed image. His father owned the largest car dealership in town, which meant Brandon had grown up assuming the world owed him deference and that consequences were things that happened to other people. Kyle was Brandon's lieutenant, shorter but stockier, with the kind of aggressive energy that manifested in constant motion and a need to prove himself worthy of Brandon's friendship through increasingly elaborate displays of cruelty. His family had money too, old Riverside money that came with a sense of entitlement and a belief that some people were simply born to serve while others were born to be served. Danny was the wild card, the one who filmed everything on his phone and provided the running commentary that turned everyday interactions into performances for an audience of social media followers who measured worth in likes and shares. Emma had been their favorite target since sophomore year, when she had inadvertently embarrassed Brandon by solving a physics problem that had stumped him during the class presentation. She hadn't meant to show him up. She had simply raised her hand when the teacher asked if anyone could identify the error in his calculations. But intention mattered less than impact, and from that moment forward, Brandon had made it his personal mission to remind Emma of her place in the social hierarchy through a campaign of systematic harassment that had only intensified as their senior year progressed. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made Emma's hands shake as she tried to focus on the derivative problem in front of her. She considered packing up her materials and fleeing to another floor, but she knew from experience that running only delayed the inevitable and often made the eventual confrontation worse. Besides, her calculus test was tomorrow, and she couldn't afford to lose study time because 3 bullies had decided to invade her space. She took a deep breath, hunched her shoulders a little lower, and hoped that maybe they would overlook her if she made herself small enough. The hope lasted exactly 37 seconds, which was how long it took for Brandon to climb the stairs, scan the nearly empty third floor, and zero in on Emma's corner table like a predator who had just spotted wounded prey. His smile was the kind that never reached his eyes, the practiced expression of someone who had learned early that cruelty was more effective when it wore a friendly mask. Emma kept her eyes fixed on her textbook as their footsteps approached, but she could feel their presence the way animals sense approaching storms. The air seemed to thicken with potential violence, and the peaceful silence that had wrapped around her like a protective blanket suddenly felt fragile and insufficient. She had learned over the years that acknowledging their presence often triggered more aggressive behavior, so she maintained her focus on the mathematical symbols that blurred slightly as her heart rate accelerated. Brandon pulled out the chair directly across from her and sat down with the kind of casual confidence that indicated he had no intention of leaving anytime soon. Kyle claimed the seat to her left while Danny positioned himself to her right, effectively boxing her into the corner with no easy escape route. The choreography was practiced, perfected through years of similar encounters in classrooms, hallways, and cafeterias where Emma had learned that being surrounded meant being trapped. Emma's parents had immigrated to America with dreams of building a better life for their daughter, working 16-hour days in their small electronics repair shop to save money for Emma's education and future opportunities. They had taught her that hard work and academic excellence were the pathways to success, that keeping her head down and focusing on her studies would eventually lead to the kind of prosperity that had eluded their own generation. They had never taught her how to deal with bullies who saw her success as a threat to their own sense of superiority, because in their experience, bullies were authority figures with power over immigration status and employment opportunities, not 17-year-old boys who used cruelty as entertainment. The first few minutes passed in tense silence as Emma continued working on her calculus problems while the three boys settled into their seats and pulled out their phones. She dared to hope that maybe they were actually here to study, that their presence was coincidental rather than predatory. But that hope evaporated when Brandon cleared his throat in the exaggerated way that always preceded his performances. Emma had been working on a particularly complex derivative when Brandon spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the false friendliness that she had learned to fear more than outright hostility. The question itself seemed innocent enough, but Emma knew from painful experience that innocence was often the opening gambit in games that ended with her humiliation and their amusement. Brandon's question about her calculus homework was delivered with the kind of exaggerated curiosity that made it clear he wasn't actually interested in mathematics. His tone carried the subtle mockery that he had perfected over years of social dominance, the ability to make even simple questions sound like challenges to her right to exist in the same space as her social superiors. Emma had learned that responding to these overtures often provided them with ammunition for extended harassment, but ignoring them completely sometimes triggered more aggressive behavior. She looked up from her textbook for the first time since they had arrived, meeting Brandon's eyes briefly before lowering her gaze again. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His smile was predatory, the expression of someone who knew he held all the power in this interaction and intended to use it for his own entertainment. Kyle and Danny flanked him like backup singers, waiting for their cue to join the performance, their phones already out and recording everything for later distribution to their social media followers. Emma's response was carefully neutral, designed to provide as little material as possible for their entertainment while still acknowledging the question enough to avoid triggering their anger at being ignored. She explained that she was working on derivatives for tomorrow's test, her voice barely above a whisper as she tried to make herself invisible through sheer force of will. The answer was factual and brief, offering no opening for extended conversation or further questioning. But Brandon wasn't interested in her academic schedule. He was interested in establishing dominance and creating content for the social media audience that validated his existence through views and comments. His follow-up question about why she spent so much time in the library carried implications that Emma recognized immediately. The suggestion that she was hiding from something or someone was designed to make her defensive, to provoke a reaction that would justify whatever escalation he had planned. Emma's parents had taught her that education was the great equalizer, that academic achievement could overcome the disadvantages of being different in a small town where conformity was valued above innovation. They had sacrificed everything to give her opportunities they never had, working 18-hour days and living in a cramped apartment above their repair shop so that Emma could focus on her studies without the burden of part-time employment. They believed that her intelligence and determination would eventually triumph over the prejudices and petty cruelties that seemed to follow her through her daily life. But sitting in that corner of the library with 3 boys whose casual cruelty had made her high school experience a daily exercise in survival, Emma began to understand that intelligence alone wasn't enough to protect her from people who viewed her success as a personal threat to their own sense of superiority. The library that had been her sanctuary was being transformed into another battlefield, another space where she would have to choose between standing up for herself and avoiding the kind of confrontation that could escalate beyond her ability to control. Brandon's next comment was more direct, a casual observation about how she seemed to think she was better than everyone else because she got good grades and spent all her time studying instead of socializing like normal teenagers. The accusation was familiar, one that had followed her since middle school when her academic achievements had first started, setting her apart from her peers. The implication that her intelligence was somehow antisocial or arrogant was a particularly effective weapon because it turned her greatest strength into evidence of character flaws. Kyle joined the conversation then, his voice carrying the eager enthusiasm of someone who had found an opportunity to prove his worth to the group's leader. His comment about how Emma probably thought she was too good for American students because she was so smart contained the subtle racism that often accompanied their harassment, the suggestion that her academic success was somehow connected to her otherness rather than her individual effort and ability. Emma's hands tightened around her pencil as she tried to focus on the mathematical equations that had always provided refuge from the chaos of social interaction. Numbers didn't lie or manipulate or try to make her feel ashamed of her intelligence. Mathematical problems had solutions that could be proven and verified, unlike the social dynamics that seemed to shift and change according to rules she had never been taught and couldn't seem to master. Danny's contribution to the conversation was more subtle but equally harmful, a seemingly innocent question about whether Emma's parents knew she spent so much time away from home and whether they worried about her being out so late every night. The question carried implications about parental supervision and family dynamics that were designed to make her feel exposed and vulnerable. It also suggested that her presence in the library was somehow inappropriate or suspicious, that a 17-year-old girl studying for calculus tests was engaged in behavior that warranted scrutiny or concern. The conversation continued for several more minutes, each comment carefully calibrated to erode Emma's sense of safety and belonging without crossing lines that might trigger intervention from library staff or other patrons. Brandon and his friends had perfected this particular form of psychological warfare over years of practice, learning how to inflict maximum emotional damage while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. Emma tried to continue working on her calculus problems, but concentration became increasingly difficult as the harassment escalated from subtle suggestions to more direct challenges. Brandon began questioning her right to occupy the table for hours at a time when other students might want to use the space, suggesting that her behavior was selfish and inconsiderate. Kyle wondered aloud whether Emma actually understood the material she was studying, or if she was just pretending to be smart to impress her teachers. The psychological pressure was carefully applied, designed to make Emma doubt herself and her place in the academic environment that had always been her refuge. They questioned her motivations, her abilities, and her right to exist in spaces they considered their own. The library that had been her sanctuary was being transformed into another venue for their entertainment, another stage where her humiliation could be performed for an audience of social media followers who measured success in views and comments. Emma's breathing became shallow as she recognized the familiar pattern of escalation that had preceded some of the worst incidents of her high school career. She knew from experience that attempting to leave now would trigger pursuit and potentially more aggressive behavior, but staying meant enduring whatever escalation they had planned. Her calculus textbook blurred slightly as tears of frustration threatened to spill over, but she blinked them back, knowing that visible emotional response would only encourage further harassment. The conversation took a darker turn when Brandon began questioning Emma's social isolation, suggesting that her lack of friends was evidence of personality defects rather than the result of systematic exclusion by students who viewed her academic success as a threat to their own status. He wondered aloud whether Emma had ever been on a date, or if boys found her too weird and antisocial to be attractive. The personal nature of these attacks represented an escalation from academic harassment to more intimate forms of cruelty designed to attack her sense of self-worth as a person rather than just a student. Kyle's addition to this line of attack was even more personal, commenting on Emma's appearance and suggesting that she dressed like someone who had given up on ever being noticed by the opposite sex. His observation that she hid behind her hair and baggy clothes was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had never experienced the vulnerability of being different in an environment that punished nonconformity. Emma's parents had taught her that beauty came from inner strength and academic achievement, that her worth as a person was measured by her kindness and intelligence rather than her ability to conform to narrow standards of teenage attractiveness. But sitting in that library corner while 3 boys dissected her appearance and social status for their own entertainment, she felt the confidence that her parents had worked so hard to build beginning to crack under the pressure of sustained psychological assault. Danny's phone captured every moment of her humiliation, recording her increasingly desperate attempts to focus on her calculus homework while they systematically destroyed her sense of safety and belonging. She knew that whatever footage he was collecting would be edited and distributed through social media channels where her pain would be transformed into entertainment for an audience that measured worth in likes and shares. The harassment continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Each comment carefully designed to erode Emma's confidence and make her question her place in the academic environment that had always been her refuge. They questioned her intelligence, her appearance, her social skills, and her right to occupy space in what they considered their domain. The library that had been her sanctuary was being transformed into another battlefield where her worth as a person was subject to their judgment and approval. Emma's hands shook as she tried to continue, working on derivatives that had become impossible to solve while under psychological siege. The mathematical equations that had always provided refuge from social chaos now seemed as unstable and unpredictable as the human interactions that had always caused her so much pain. She found herself calculating escape routes and timing their movements, her mind automatically shifting into survival mode as the situation continued to escalate. Brandon's voice took on a more aggressive tone as he began questioning Emma's right to take up valuable library space when other students might want to study there. His suggestion that she was being selfish and inconsiderate was delivered with the kind of false reasonableness that made opposition seem unreasonable. He wondered aloud whether the library staff knew that she was monopolizing resources and whether her behavior might violate policies about appropriate use of public facilities. The suggestion that her presence was somehow inappropriate or policy violating represented another escalation in their psychological warfare. They were now questioning not just her social status or academic abilities, but her fundamental right to exist in the space that had become her refuge. The implication that library Staff might need to be informed about her behavior was a threat disguised as a reasonable observation. Kyle's contribution to this new line of attack was more direct, suggesting that Emma's long hours in the library might be covering for problems at home or personal issues that made her unable to function in normal social environments. His speculation about her family situation and mental health was delivered with fake concern that barely masked his intent to humiliate and isolate her further. Emma's resolve began to weaken under the sustained assault on her sense of belonging and self-worth. The calculus problems that had seemed manageable an hour ago now appeared impossible to solve while under psychological siege. Her hands trembled as she tried to focus on mathematical concepts that required the kind of mental clarity that was impossible to maintain while being systematically dehumanized by people who viewed her pain as entertainment. The situation reached a new level of intensity when Brandon stood up and moved to the chair directly beside Emma, close enough that she could smell his cologne and feel the heat radiating from his body. The physical proximity was intimidating and deliberate, designed to make her feel trapped and vulnerable. His voice dropped to a whisper as he leaned closer, his words audible only to her but clearly being recorded by Danny's ever-present phone. Brandon's whispered comments were more personal and threatening than anything he had said while speaking to the group. He questioned her understanding of social hierarchies and suggested that her academic success was creating problems for students who belonged in advanced classes more than she did. His implication that she was taking opportunities away from more deserving students carried undertones of racial and economic prejudice that made his harassment feel systematic rather than random. Emma's breathing became more labored as Brandon's physical presence made escape seem increasingly impossible. She was trapped in the corner with no easy exit route, surrounded by 3 boys who seemed to view her discomfort as confirmation of their own power and status. The library that had been her sanctuary was being transformed into a cage, where her humiliation could be performed for an audience that would never see her as fully human. Kyle and Danny moved closer as well, creating a wall of male bodies that blocked Emma's view of the rest of the library and prevented anyone else from witnessing the full extent of what was happening. Their positioning was strategic, designed to isolate her completely while maintaining the appearance of a normal study group to any casual observers who might glance in their direction. The harassment reached a crescendo when Brandon began questioning Emma's mental stability, suggesting that her social isolation and academic obsession might be signs of psychological problems that required professional intervention. His fake concern about her well-being was delivered with the kind of patronizing tone that made resistance seem like evidence of the very problems he was describing. Emma's world narrowed to the mathematical equations in front of her and the voices surrounding her, each comment designed to make her question her own perception of reality and her right to defend herself against their attacks. The calculus that had always provided refuge from chaos now seemed as unstable and unpredictable as the social dynamics that had always caused her so much pain. But something in Emma's core remained unbroken despite the sustained psychological assault. Deep beneath the fear and humiliation, a spark of resistance flickered like a flame that refused to be extinguished. She thought about her parents working 18-hour days to give her opportunities they never had, about the dreams they had sacrificed everything to make possible, about the future that awaited her if she could just survive the present moment. The mathematical precision that had always been her strength began to assert itself even in this chaos. Emma found herself calculating angles and distances, timing movements and measuring responses with the same methodical approach she brought to solving derivatives. Her mind, trained by years of academic discipline, began to shift from victim mode to problem-solving mode as she realized that this situation, like every other challenge she had faced, required a solution rather than surrender. Brandon's next comment would prove to be his crucial mistake. The moment when his casual cruelty crossed a line that transformed Emma from prey into predator. His suggestion that she might be more comfortable studying at the community college with other people who didn't really belong in advanced academic programs contained the kind of systematic prejudice that had fueled her determination to succeed despite every obstacle placed in her path. The words hit Emma like a physical blow, but instead of breaking her spirit, they ignited something that had been building inside her for years. Every comment, every sneer, every moment of casual cruelty that had accompanied her journey through high school crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. She understood with mathematical precision that this was not random teenage cruelty, but systematic oppression designed to keep her in her assigned place in a social hierarchy that had never made room for quiet girls who dared to excel. Emma's hands stopped shaking as she closed her calculus textbook with deliberate precision. The motion was small but significant, a signal that the phase of passive endurance was ending and something new was beginning. Brandon noticed the change in her demeanor and smiled more broadly, mistaking her stillness for submission and her silence for defeat. But Emma had learned something about herself in that corner of the library that would change everything that followed. She had discovered that there were limits to how much humiliation she could absorb before something fundamental shifted inside her. The quiet girl who had spent 4 years making herself smaller to avoid conflict was about to discover that some situations required expansion rather than contraction, that survival sometimes demanded taking up space rather than surrendering it. The mathematical mind that had carried her through years of academic achievement was now focused on a different kind of problem, one that required physical rather than intellectual solutions. Emma's breathing steadied as she prepared to respond to their challenge with capabilities they had never suspected she possessed. The shy girl who had been their favorite target was about to reveal that stillness and strength were not mutually exclusive, that quiet people sometimes possessed the most devastating forms of power. Brandon leaned even closer, his whispered words designed to deliver the final blow to her resistance. But as his voice carried the familiar tone of casual cruelty that had accompanied 4 years of systematic harassment, Emma realized that she had reached the end of her capacity for passive endurance. The corner of the library that had been her prison was about to become their nightmare, as the quiet girl they had underestimated prepared to demonstrate that some people fight back with precision that mathematics had taught her and fury that years of injustice had forged. The transformation was invisible but absolute, as Emma's mind shifted from victim to strategist, from prey to predator, from someone who absorbed cruelty to someone who was about to return it with interest, calculated to the precise degree their behavior had earned. The aftermath of Emma's defensive demonstration spread through Riverside High School's social networks like wildfire through dry grass, transforming her from anonymous academic achiever into legendary figure whose story would be retold with increasing dramatic flourish for years to come. The video footage that Danny had captured before his phone was confiscated became the most viewed content in the school's history, shared and reshared until Emma's precise combat techniques were analyzed frame by students who had never previously shown interest in martial arts or social justice. The disciplinary hearing that took place 3 days later was conducted in the principal's conference room, a sterile space where educational bureaucracy attempted to process an incident that defied easy categorization. Emma sat between her parents and the legal advocate they had hired, her demeanor calm and professional as she faced a panel of administrators whose primary concern seemed to be limiting the school district's liability, rather than addressing the systematic harassment that had precipitated the confrontation. Principal Stevens opened the proceedings by reading from a prepared statement about the district's zero-tolerance policy regarding violence, his words carefully chosen to avoid acknowledging the circumstances that had made Emma's actions necessary. The institutional response reflected the same willful blindness that had enabled Brandon Kyle and Danny to conduct their harassment campaign without interference, a systemic failure to distinguish between aggression and legitimate self-defense that perpetuated cycles of victimization. Emma's legal advocate, Jennifer Walsh, responded with documentation that painted a comprehensive picture of the systematic harassment her client had endured throughout her high school career. The evidence included screenshots of social media posts, witness statements from students who had observed the bullying, and medical records documenting stress-related health issues that Emma had developed as a direct result of the hostile environment she faced daily. The presentation was methodical and devastating, each piece of evidence building upon the previous one to create an undeniable case for institutional negligence. The school's response evolved rapidly as the legal implications became clear. Administrators, suddenly discovering surveillance footage and incident reports that had somehow been overlooked during the years when Emma had been requesting help with harassment issues. The documentation revealed a pattern of complaints that had been dismissed or minimized, requests for intervention that had been ignored, and escalating behavior that had been treated as normal teenage interaction rather than systematic abuse, requiring administrative response. Brandon's parents attended the hearing with their own legal representation, their initial strategy of portraying their son as the victim of unprovoked violence crumbling as evidence of his leadership role in the harassment campaign became undeniable. The football coach who had praised Brandon's leadership qualities and recommendation letters found himself struggling to explain how those same leadership skills had been applied to organizing and directing systematic cruelty against academically successful students. Kyle's family took a different approach, acknowledging his participation in the harassment while attempting to minimize his role as a follower rather than an instigator. Their attorney argued that peer pressure and Brandon's influence had led Kyle to participate in behavior that was fundamentally inconsistent with his character, a defense that might have been more convincing if not for the enthusiastic participation documented in Danny's video archive. Danny's cooperation with the investigation continued to be complete and immediate, his terror at the potential consequences driving him to provide detailed accounts of harassment incidents dating back to their sophomore year. His testimony revealed the systematic nature of their campaign, the careful planning that went into each humiliation, and the social media strategy they had developed to maximize the psychological impact of their attacks on Emma and other vulnerable students. The legal settlement that emerged from the proceedings was confidential, but sources close to the negotiations suggested that the school district's financial responsibility was substantial enough to fund comprehensive anti-bullying programs and staff training initiatives. Emma's family declined to discuss the specific terms, but her parents' ability to reduce their working hours at the electronics repair shop suggested that their daughter's ordeal had at least resulted in financial compensation that would ease some of the economic pressures that had shaped their immigrant experience. The criminal charges against the three boys were resolved through plea agreements that reflected the complexity of a case where traditional victim-offender categories had been complicated by Emma's effective self-defense. Brandon and Kyle pleaded guilty to harassment and assault charges that resulted in community service, mandatory counseling, and probation terms that would affect their college applications and future opportunities. Danny's cooperation earned him a more lenient sentence, but his role in documenting and distributing harassment content still resulted in legal consequences that would follow him beyond graduation. The social transformation at Riverside High School was more dramatic than any official policy change, as Emma's story inspired other students who had been suffering in silence to document their experiences and demand institutional response to harassment they had previously endured without hope of relief. The administration found itself dealing with dozens of complaints that had been suppressed by fear of retaliation, creating a crisis that required systematic reform rather than superficial policy adjustments. Master Kim's Martial Arts Academy. experienced an unprecedented surge in enrollment as parents throughout the community decided that their children needed the kind of preparation that had enabled Emma to protect herself when all other systems failed. The quiet instructor found himself explaining to news reporters that self-defense was only one component of martial arts training, that the real value lay in building confidence and character rather than simply learning how to hurt people who threatened you. Emma's academic performance, rather than suffering from the stress of the confrontation and its aftermath, actually improved as the psychological burden of constant harassment was lifted from her shoulders. Her calculus test scores reached new heights. Her college application essays reflected a maturity and self-awareness that impressed admissions officers, and her scholarship opportunities multiplied as universities competed to recruit a student whose story embodied resilience and intellectual achievement despite adversity. The college recruitment process revealed the extent to which Emma's story had resonated beyond the boundaries of Riverside High School, with admissions officers from prestigious institutions expressing interest in a student who had demonstrated both academic excellence and the character to stand up for herself when circumstances demanded action. The narrative that emerged was exactly what competitive universities sought: intellectual achievement combined with personal courage and the ability to overcome systematic obstacles through determination and skill. Emma's essay for her MIT application focused not on the dramatic confrontation that had made her temporarily famous, but on the mathematical precision that had characterized her approach to self-defense and the way that academic discipline had informed her response to crisis. The admissions committee was impressed by her ability to analyze the incident objectively, to identify the variables that had contributed to the conflict, and to calculate solutions that minimized harm while achieving necessary objectives. The scholarship offers that followed were numerous and generous, with several universities providing full rides that would cover not only tuition and fees, but also living expenses that would allow Emma to focus entirely on her studies without the part-time employment that had seemed inevitable given her family's financial situation. The opportunities represented validation that academic excellence combined with personal integrity could indeed overcome the systematic disadvantages that had shaped her high school experience. Rosa and Miguel Chen's pride in their daughters' achievements was complicated by concern about the attention her story had attracted, their immigrant instincts warning them that visibility could bring scrutiny and potential problems even when the initial response was positive. They had spent years teaching Emma to keep her head down and avoid drawing attention to herself, strategies that had served their family well during the difficult early years of establishing themselves in a new country. But Emma's transformation had taught them that invisibility was not always protection, that sometimes standing up and fighting back was the only way to establish the respect necessary for genuine safety. The martial arts training they had sacrificed to provide had proven its worth not just in physical terms, but in building the kind of confidence that would serve their daughter well throughout her life, whatever challenges she might face in the future. The media attention that followed Emma's story was extensive but generally positive, with journalists focusing on the broader implications of her experience for discussions about bullying, school safety, and the importance of providing students with resources for self-protection when institutional systems failed to provide adequate support. The coverage emphasized her academic achievements and future potential rather than sensationalizing the violence that had been necessary to protect herself. Master Kim's interviews with reporters provided context for Emma's actions that helped the public understand the disciplined approach to self-defense that had prevented the situation from escalating beyond necessary force. His explanations of martial arts philosophy and the emphasis on restraint and precision helped counter narratives that might have portrayed Emma's response as excessive or inappropriate given the circumstances she faced. The long-term social changes at Riverside High School proved to be more substantial than anyone had anticipated, with Emma's example inspiring a cultural shift that that made harassment and bullying significantly more difficult to sustain. Students who had previously remained silent when witnessing abuse began intervening, creating a peer accountability system that supplemented official policies with social pressure that proved remarkably effective. The three boys' attempts to rebuild their reputations and social standing met with limited success, as their former victims found voices they had never possessed before Emma's example showed them that resistance was possible. The social media platforms that had been weapons of harassment became venues for accountability, with former targets sharing their experiences and creating public records of behavior that colleges and employers would eventually discover during background investigations. Brandon's football career effectively ended with his legal troubles, college scouts losing interest in a player whose character issues outweighed his athletic abilities. The leadership qualities that coaches had praised became liabilities when applied to organizing harassment campaigns, and the social dominance that had made him attractive to recruiters became evidence of problems that universities preferred to avoid. Kyle's recovery was complicated by lingering physical effects from Emma's precisely targeted strikes, martial arts techniques that had been calculated to cause temporary incapacitation rather than permanent damage, but that nevertheless reminded him daily of the consequences of systematic cruelty. The medical evaluation that followed revealed no lasting injuries, but the psychological impact of being physically dominated by someone he had spent years victimizing proved more difficult to overcome. Danny's technical skills, which had been employed in service of documenting other people's humiliation, were redirected toward more constructive purposes as part of his community service requirements. His work with anti-bullying organizations provided him with perspective on the impact of his previous behavior, while developing capabilities that might eventually contribute to positive social change rather than perpetuating cycles of abuse. The legal precedent established by Emma's case influenced policy discussions throughout the state, with legislators and educators examining the implications of systematic harassment and the circumstances under which self-defense might be considered not just legally justified, but morally necessary. The documentation of institutional failure to protect vulnerable students became part of broader conversations about school accountability and the responsibilities of educational institutions. Emma's graduation from Riverside High School was triumphant rather than merely celebratory, her status as valedictorian reflecting not just academic achievement, but the kind of character that enabled success despite systematic obstacles. The speech she delivered focused on the importance of standing up for yourself and others, the value of preparation and discipline, and the mathematical certainty that courage plus knowledge equals positive change. The summer before college provided Emma with time to reflect on the transformation her life had undergone. From systematic victim to empowered advocate, whose story had inspired changes that extended far beyond her personal experience. The quiet girl who had spent years making herself smaller to avoid conflict had discovered that some situations required expansion rather than contraction, that survival sometimes demanded taking up space rather than surrendering it. Master Kim's final lessons before Emma left for MIT focused not on new techniques, but on the responsibility that came with the capabilities she had developed. The power to protect herself and others was also the obligation to use that power wisely, to apply force only when necessary, and to never forget that strength without restraint became tyranny rather than justice. The electronics repair shop where Emma's parents had worked 18-hour days to fund her education became busier as their reputation in the community grew. Customers drawn by respect for a family that had raised a daughter capable of achieving academic excellence while maintaining the character to stand up for herself when circumstances demanded action. The economic benefits were modest but meaningful, providing stability that had been elusive during the early years of their immigrant experience. Emma's departure for MIT was emotional but optimistic, her parents' tears reflecting pride rather then sorrow as they watched their daughter leave for opportunities they had sacrificed everything to make possible. The full scholarship she had earned would cover all expenses, meaning that the financial burden they had carried for years was finally lifted at the same time that their daughter achieved the educational goals that had motivated their immigration to America. The dormitory room at MAT that Emma moved into that fall was shared with a roommate whose academic achievements were equally impressive, but whose background reflected privilege rather than struggle. The friendship that developed between them illustrated the way that academic excellence could bridge differences in experience and opportunity, creating connections based on intellectual compatibility rather than social similarity. The martial arts club at MAT welcomed Emma with enthusiasm, her story having preceded her arrival and made her something of a legend among students who appreciated both her technical skills and the circumstances under which she had been forced to apply them. The training sessions provided continuity with the discipline that had sustained her through high school while introducing her to new techniques and training partners who challenged her to continue developing her capabilities. The calculus courses that had seemed so challenging at Riverside High School proved to be foundational rather than advanced by MIT standards, but Emma's study habits and mathematical discipline served her well as she adapted to the accelerated pace and increased rigor of university-level mathematics. The corner table in the campus library where she established her study routine was claimed without apology, her confidence in occupying academic space reflecting the transformation that had occurred during her final months of high school. The story of the quiet girl who had defended herself in the Riverside Public Library became part of campus folklore, retold by students who had never experienced systematic harassment, but who recognized the courage required to stand up against overwhelming odds. The legend that developed emphasized not the violence that had been necessary, but the preparation and character that had made effective self-defense possible when all other options had been exhausted. Emma's success at MIT exceeded even her own expectations, her grades reflecting not just intellectual capability, but the kind of mental discipline that had been forged through years of overcoming obstacles that might have defeated students with fewer resources and less determination. The research opportunities that became available to her during her sophomore year led to publications and recognition that established her as a rising star in applied mathematics. The internship opportunities that followed were numerous and prestigious, with technology companies and research institutions competing to recruit a student whose academic achievements were matched by the kind of character that made her an attractive long-term investment. The interviews revealed that Emma's story had spread far beyond the boundaries of MIT, inspiring admiration from professionals who valued both intellectual capability and the courage to stand up for principles when circumstances demanded action. The commencement address that Emma delivered 4 years later as MIT's valedictorian focused on the mathematical certainty that preparation plus opportunity equals success, but also acknowledged that sometimes the most important preparation involved learning to defend yourself when systems designed to protect you prove inadequate or unwilling to fulfill their responsibilities. The speech was recorded and shared widely, inspiring students at universities throughout the country who faced their own versions of systematic harassment and institutional indifference. The job offers that followed graduation were extraordinary in both number and quality, with leading technology companies, research institutions, and consulting firms competing to recruit someone whose academic achievements were enhanced by the kind of personal story that made her an attractive spokesperson for organizational values related to diversity, inclusion, and character under pressure. Emma's choice to accept a position with a cybersecurity firm reflected her interest in using mathematical skills to protect people from digital harassment and systematic abuse, the technological evolution of the same problems she had faced during high school. The work involved developing algorithms and systems that could identify and neutralize online bullying before it escalated to the point where physical self-defense became necessary. The success she achieved in her professional career was built upon the same foundation of discipline, preparation, and courage that had enabled her to survive and eventually thrive despite systematic harassment that might have broken students with less determination and fewer resources. The quiet girl who had been forced to defend herself in a library had become a leader whose work protected countless others from similar experiences. The martial arts training that had saved Emma during her darkest moment at Riverside High School continued throughout her adult life, evolving from self-defense necessity into spiritual practice that provided balance and perspective in a demanding professional environment. Master Kim's lessons about the responsibility that accompanied capability remained central to her approach to both personal relationships and professional challenges. The story of Emma Chen became required reading in anti-bullying curricula throughout the educational system, her experience providing both cautionary tale about institutional failure and inspirational example of individual resilience and preparation. The mathematical precision that had characterized her response to systematic harassment became a metaphor for the kind of disciplined approach to problem solving that could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Years later, when reporters asked Emma to reflect on the incident that had transformed her from victim to symbol of resistance, her response focused not on the violence that had been necessary, but on the preparation that had made effective response possible and the systematic changes that had followed to ensure that future students would have better options than physical self-defense when facing harassment and institutional indifference. The library at Riverside High School eventually installed a plaque near the third-floor philosophy section commemorating Emma's achievements and the systematic reforms that had followed her graduation, recognizing both her individual courage and the collective responsibility to protect vulnerable students from the kind of systematic abuse that had nearly derailed her educational journey. The quiet corner where Emma had been forced to defend herself became a symbol of transformation rather than trauma, a reminder that preparation combined with courage could overcome systematic oppression and that individual resistance could inspire collective change. The mathematical equation that had been solved that day continued to resonate. Systematic harassment plus legitimate self-defense equals justice, with variables balanced to produce results that extended far beyond the immediate participants. The legacy of that March afternoon in the Riverside Public Library lived on in the lives of students who learned to stand up for themselves and others, in the institutional changes that made harassment more difficult to sustain, and in the recognition that sometimes the most profound education occurred not in classrooms, but in moments when character was tested and found sufficient to meet whatever challenges life might present. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.